If you look at my academic history at Cambridge, I switched subjects every year, and it didn't make any sense at all. When you look back on it, it was all very useful. But at the time, it was just a crazy random walk.
I can relate to that. Isn't it marvellous how indecision in what might be called one's career path can, in the end, with the passage of time, look like acquiring sensible background? And in Geoffrey Hinton's case, boy, did he flourish once he did eventually find the question that he was really interested in addressing. And it led him to become one of the founding fathers of artificial intelligence. So join me now as we listen to him recount how he explored some of those blind avenues and then eventually found the light at the end of the tunnel. Light, which for him has, over recent years, turned a bit darker.
This is Nobel Prize Conversations, and our guest is Geoffrey Hinton, recipient of the 2024 prize in physics. He was awarded for foundational discoveries and inventions that enable machine learning with artificial neural networks. He shared the prize with John Hopfield. Your host is Adam Smith, Chief Scientific Officer at Nobel Prize Outreach. This podcast was produced in cooperation with Fundación Ramón Arreces. Geoffrey Hinton is co-founder and chief scientific advisor of the Vector Institute in Toronto. He talks to Adam about how to best cool your coffee and why we say bite down instead of up. But ultimately, they reveal how these mundane musings cut to the core of the question, what makes us human? But first, Geoffrey Hinton talks about growing up with a father who favoured bugs over his children.
You come from a very scientific background. There are a lot of scientists in your forebears, and your father was a great entomologist. Did that influence you to become a scientist? Did you feel that it was in the blood?
Yes, I felt a lot of pressure to become a scientist. I was expected to become a scientist, but I always enjoyed science, so that was okay. When I was little, I wanted to be an entomologist because my father was an entomologist.
He shared with the Lord an inordinate fondness for beetles.
Oh, you read that, right.
Yeah, it was beetles he specialised in.
And lots of other insects too, but beetles were his favourite. And among beetles, it was the family Almidae that was his real favourite.
Did you have to compete with beetles for his favour?
My sister often said that he would have loved us more if we had 6 legs. And in his office, he had an office at the university that was very high. The ceiling must have been about 16 feet high. And the walls were all lined with shelves, and he had a stepladder so he could get at them. And the walls were covered with hundreds of boxes, and each box would have papers, reprints. This was before Xerox machines, right? It would have reprints of papers from journals, and on the box there would be the name of the genus of insect that the reprint was about, or maybe the family. And so there were hundreds of these boxes. When he died, we sold them to the University of Florida for £10,000. Among those boxes, there was one box that was a bit smaller and was next to the door on a lower shelf. And on that box, it said, "Not insects." And that was the rest of his life. And that had things like letters from his children and...
Well, at least you were differentiated from the insects. You were something special.
Yes, slightly smaller.
But if you were expected to be a scientist, did that necessarily mean that you wanted to follow expectations, or did you want to break away and be something different?
Not until I was late in my teens did I want to break away and do something different. So when I first went to Cambridge, I was doing science, and it took a lot of time to do it properly. You went to lectures in the morning, did experiments in the afternoon, and then in the evening I would rewrite the notes I'd made during the lectures to make them neat, and so that I went over it once more. And then it would be time to go to bed, and it was like 12-hour days I was doing. And after a month, I just got totally fed up with it, and I left.
Cambridge?
I left Cambridge. That was the first time I made a decision on my own.
Golly, that must have gone down badly.
It went down quite badly, yes. I went back a year later. But
what did you do with the time that you had between first start and second start?
I went to London and got several different menial jobs in order to pay the rent on an apartment. And I read a lot of depressing novels by people like Dostoevsky.
Sounds like independence.
Yes. I decided I wanted to be an architect. Fortunately, before I actually went back the next fall, I spent the summer working in an architect's office and discovered what architects actually do, which isn't as romantic as what you think they do. Sketch out airy buildings. What they actually do is decide, are you going to have cheap door handles or cheap flooring? Because there's no way you're going to meet the budget without doing one of those two. And after a day of doing architecture, I went and talked to my tutor and switched back to doing science. But I switched back to doing physics and chemistry and physiology. The first time I'd been there, I did physics and chemistry in crystalline state, which was a new subject they were teaching because of the success of X-ray crystallography in getting the structure of DNA, I think. X-ray crystallography was a big thing then. And when I went back, I didn't do that. Instead, I did physiology. And that was the first time I'd done any biology. And I found it fascinating.
And had you found your path once you made the change to physiology?
No. At the end of the physiology course, there was a section which I was really looking forward to about the central nervous system. And I thought they would tell us how it worked, I was very interested in how it worked. And instead, they told us how the axons of neurons conduct action potentials, how a wave of depolarization goes down the axon. But that didn't exactly tell us how it worked. And I thought they were going to tell us how it worked. And so I got very fed up. And I switched to doing philosophy.
Which is definitely studying how it works.
I thought I'd learn more about the mind. I didn't. I did a year of philosophy and basically developed antibodies to philosophy.
There seems to be a bit of a theme here.
If you look at my academic history at Cambridge, I switched subjects every year and it didn't make any sense at all. When you look back on it, it was all very useful. But at the time, it was just a crazy random walk.
So often in life that's true. You can make sense of it in reverse, but yes.
Yes.
Well, presumably you did quite well in all these things, so they hung on to you and said, okay, fine.
No. In my first year, I did well in physics, but I knew I couldn't carry on in physics because my math wasn't good enough. Advanced mathematics I found very difficult. I did quite well in physiology and okay in chemistry. Then when I did philosophy, I did just okay. And then I switched to psychology, and I didn't really like that at all.
Again, were you looking for a way to get into the mind?
Yes, I thought psychologists would tell us how people worked. And instead it was rats in mazes. And there was some stuff that retrospectively is interesting. Signal detection theory, how you distinguish between noise and very faint signals. And there's some interesting mathematics there. But it wasn't exactly what I wanted to know. I wanted to know how people worked.
So, Adam, did Geoffrey Hinton find out how people work?
I don't think anybody's found out how people work yet. I think the brain's just too complicated for us, just at the moment.
He talks about two things in the conversation that I need to understand better, and that's neural networks and large language models. Can you enlighten me a little bit?
Well, yes, I'll give it a go. The neural network is a step towards understanding how people work, in that it's arranging processes in a way that seeks to mimic what happens in the brain. In the brain, you have neurons arranged broadly in layers and hugely interconnected. And in a neural network, you have processes arranged in layers, and there's an input layer where information comes in, and there's an output layer where information goes out, and then in between there are these hidden layers. And in the brain, our understanding is that neurons reinforce their connections with each other when they send electrical signals to each other. So standardly, people say neurons that fire together, wire together. And the same is happening in a neural network where nodes with inputs that are leading to the right answers further down the stream are reinforced. And you program a neural network with a set of rules, and then it turns out that they are so-called adaptive and that they can develop new rules for themselves, allowing them to get close to the right answer.
So building a synthetic brain then, basically?
Yes, exactly. And that's what he was seeking to do. And very few people thought he was going to succeed, but he did. And that led him to become, as everyone likes to say, the godfather of AI. And then a large language model, well, that broadly describes the way that these infrastructures are used to input huge complex data sets, and then the model is able to recognize and interpret that data set and give you an output, which makes sense. As the name large language model implies, that refers initially to producing text, as we all know from something like ChatGPT. but it can also work with visual data or any sorts of complex data. And in the case of one of the Nobel Prizes awarded last October, of course, that data was protein folding data, which AlphaFold 2 was able to interpret.
And what specifically did Geoffrey Hinton get his Nobel Prize for?
For the development of that initial neural network, which had introduced concepts of statistical mechanics, which allowed his neural network to recognize characteristic elements in sets of data.
Apart from creating a digital brain, Geoffrey Hinton himself also seems to have a very interesting mind.
Doesn't switch off much. Yeah, he seems to be constantly on the lookout. Before we started recording, somehow we started talking about religion, and I said, let's not go there. And he said, why not? So we went there. We chatted about it a little before the recording started. And I think it was just indicative of the fact that, not much slips by.
So what was his take on religion then?
Yeah, he's not keen on it. He thinks it's all fake news, that those who believe are deluded. But then again, there are others who very much believe in an evidence-based view of the world who have space for religion as well. So
he doesn't seem to mind to disagree with people.
He certainly doesn't. And I think, again, it's the characteristic of so many laureates, not that they necessarily want to hold contrary views, but that they are not fazed by having people criticise their view of things. This conversation about religion is well worth having, but I don't think it's a conversation that can be had by scientists alone.
Indeed.
Anyway, that mind is constantly operating, even in the dentist chair, it turns out. Let's listen.
At least in Canada and Britain, I don't know about elsewhere in the world, when you go to the dentist and they want to see if your lower teeth fit your upper teeth properly, they say, bite down. Now, you don't actually bite down, you bite up. So why do they say bite down? And they all say it. And I've asked dentists, why do you say bite down instead of bite up? And they don't have an answer. They spend their whole life saying bite down, and it's never occurred to them that, well, you actually bite up. So why do you say bite down?
And?
Oh, you want to know why they say it?
Yes, please.
Okay. Well, I was once eating some bony fish. This really is an explanation of why they say bite down.
I'm with you, yes.
I was once eating some bony fish in a cafeteria with a friend, and we were trying to play blindfold chess. Now, we weren't that good at chess, and we kept sort of moving bishops through pawns and things, but we were trying to play blindfold chess, and I realised you can't play blindfold chess while eating bony fish. And the reason is the sort of spatial processes you use for dealing with where things are in space and how they're relating to each other. It's the same spatial processor you use both for playing the blindfold chess and for finding the bones in the fish. It's not like you have a separate piece of apparatus for dealing with what's going on inside your mouth and what's going on in this chess game. It's the same spatial processor you're using, so you get a lot of interference. You can't do both at once. It's like trying to hold two conversations at once. So the question is, when you use that spatial processor for dealing with things inside the mouth, how does that relate to how you use it for dealing with things outside the mouth? So if, for example, I'm reaching for objects, there's a kind of me and I'm doing the reaching for the objects. If I'm thinking about what's going on inside my mouth, what's me and where's the sort of center of my frame of reference? So inside your mouth, your tongue is you. The tongue's the bit you can move. I mean, you can move the jaw too, but the tongue is you, and you sort of feel around with the tip of your tongue. And if you're looking for bones in the fish, you sort of feel for them with the tip of your tongue. So the tongue is you. Now, the tongue is attached to the lower jaw. And so if you ask, what moves relative to the tongue? Well, what moves relative to the tongue is your upper teeth. When I contract the jaw muscle so my jaw closes, the tongue doesn't move relative to the lower teeth. There's no danger that you'll bite your tongue with your lower teeth because they're not moving relative to the tongue. The thing that bites your tongue is your upper teeth. And of course, what you need to worry about inside your mouth is biting your tongue. That's the most important thing not to do. You are your tongue, and you don't want to get bitten. And these upper teeth are coming down on your tongue. And so, of course, you think of it in terms of biting down.
It's all about frames of reference.
It's all about frames of reference, which I'm very interested in. And that's my best explanation of why dentists say bite down. But the point of this whole story is, there is an explanation of why they say it that I think is pretty good. But nobody ever asks a question. Nobody ever says, wait a minute, the teeth come up, so why do they say bite down? There's huge numbers of questions that nobody ever asks. So my son, when he was very little, asked a question that very few kids ask. He said, Daddy, why do bridges stay up? And the point is, there's nothing underneath the bridge. And he was just beginning to understand that it's odd that bridges stay up.
It's a lovely, good question. All this asking of questions and finding solutions, that can slow you up. I suppose most people are rushing through things, and stopping to ask is time-consuming.
Yes, it is.
As well as being intellectually taxing.
I've always envied people who can just read a lot of stuff. If I start reading a scientific paper, I keep getting sidetracked. It takes me a whole day to get through a scientific paper because I'll read a little bit and think, wait a minute, or it'll remind me of something else. And so, yeah, I get sidetracked a lot by asking questions. And I actually like making up questions just for the fun of trying to figure out the answers. So, for example, if you take a coffee cup and you put the coffee in, then you have to go and do something. You know you're coming back in 5 minutes and you want the coffee to be as cool as possible in 5 minutes. Should you put the milk in when you've just put the coffee in? Or should you leave it and put the milk in when you come back? And the answer is, roughly speaking, that you should leave it and put the milk in when you come back, because the coffee will be hotter if you haven't put the milk in, and so it will cool faster. So you'll be losing heat faster if the coffee doesn't have the milk in. Then you put the milk in when you come back, and it cools it down some more. But it'll end up coolest if you put the milk in later. But suppose that the coffee cup is conical shaped, because it's losing heat from the surface of the coffee. And so if you put the milk in, you get a bigger surface. So although the coffee overall, if the milk mixes with the coffee, the overall thing's a bit cooler, it's got a bigger surface. So that must mean there's some shape of coffee mug where it doesn't matter whether you put the milk in first or later, it'll cool the same amount. It depends a bit on sort of exactly how much coffee you put in and how much milk you put in. But I think most people don't get sidetracked by wondering things like, if we had the right shaped coffee mug, we wouldn't have to worry about whether we put in the milk first or second.
Absolutely not. I think that sounds like a wonderful physics project for some undergraduate to work out what the ideal shape of cup is. But yes, it sounds like the sort of question which really normally elicits the answer, oh, Dad, honestly.
I actually had my daughter was used to me lecturing her on scientific theories. And one morning when she was a teenager, I came down to breakfast early. She used to come down early because she had to get to school. She said, "You're down early, Dad?" And I said, "Yes, I think I figured out how the brain works." And my daughter said, "Oh, no, Dad, not again."
All this reminds me of a nice thing Garrison Keillor said about old people. He said the reason old people walk so slowly is that everything they see reminds them of something, and so they have to stop and think about it.
I think it's because their bodies don't work so well.
Oh, how prosaic. And how factual and how true. Actually, that brings me on to, I suppose, a question of your own upbringing. How did that experience translate into the way you brought up your own kids? I think we've already seen an insight into that.
Yes, my kids, my daughter in particular, doesn't want to be a scientist. She never did want to be a scientist. So she would occasionally get very cross with me for trying to explain things scientifically when she wasn't interested.
I suppose I was getting to the expectation piece, given that there were obviously huge expectations placed on you.
So my children are both adopted, and that changes the imposition of expectations somewhat. I think that made a difference.
You've had a very interesting path through academia and business. I wanted to ask what it was that really attracts you to an environment. Where do you feel happy working? What defines somewhere you're happy?
I guess I need two things. I need smart other people to talk to who know things I don't know. So one of the best collaborators I've ever had was Terry Sinofsky, who knows a lot of physics and a lot of biology that I don't know. And he also reads a lot, so he knows all the literature, which I don't. And that's been a very good collaboration. The other thing I need in an environment is smart graduate students. So at universities, if you have a PhD student, you're stuck with them and they're stuck with you for about 5 years. And that's long enough so that after they've got used to you and you've got used to them, you still have 4 years left and they can try doing things that fail and they can spend 6 months trying to do something that fails, and that's not the end of the world. And that's great training for them, and it's a great resource for the advisor to get them to try things and try them really hard. The one disadvantage I found at Google is that the junior research scientists at Google work with more senior scientists on projects, and they'll work on a project for a while because it sounds interesting. But when the going gets tough, if after a month it hasn't produced anything, they'll go off and work with some other scientist. They have too much freedom. Now, these are typically people who've already done PhDs, so they deserve some freedom. But that's something you have at universities that you don't have at the big companies, not in the same way. So I think a lot of original research will continue to be done at universities, because I think this kind of apprenticeship system, where you have an advisor and a student, and the student's apprenticed to the advisor and stays as an apprentice for several years, I think that works very well for exploring new ideas. And it's an advantage that the students don't yet know that much, so they don't have all sorts of opinions of their own. Or if they do have an opinion of their own, it's sort of fresh, and they can see things from new angles. So I think actually for fundamental original research, universities are better than the big companies. But for resources, the big companies are much better.
And in your particular field of deep learning and neural networks, is there now such a need for resources that the balance of power, if you like, in research is shifting a bit towards the companies?
Yeah, it's a real mess that for these large models, you need a lot of resources. And that sort of puts universities at a big disadvantage. So that's one big disadvantage. The other big disadvantage, it may change in the near future, I don't know. The companies just pay a lot more. For a good PhD, a good researcher who's just got a PhD in machine learning, a few years ago, they could go to one of the big companies and get paid $300,000 a year. If they went to a university, they'd get paid $150,000 a year if it was a relatively rich department. So that just gives the big companies a huge edge. So if you work for a big tobacco company and you want to tell people that tobacco causes cancer, you maybe start telling them when you work for the company, but really what you should do is quit the company and tell people tobacco causes cancer. So I felt quite strongly. Google treated me very well, and the people I dealt with at Google were very nice people. So I felt wrong about criticizing Google and other companies for not paying enough attention to safety while working for them. They actually, when I said I was leaving, they said, well, you could stay here and say whatever you like and work on AI safety. I just didn't feel right. You're just much cleaner if you don't work for the company. And so the people who are uninhibited in saying what they think about AI safety are generally people who don't work for a company, or people, unlike some of the people at OpenAI, who are about to leave the company.
And your contention is that we are closer to a dangerously intelligent form of deep learning than people think.
Yeah, so there's two kinds of dangers of AI. There's the kind of AI we have now being misused by bad people. So being misused, for example, to target voters to get them to stay home rather than voting for Kamala Harris. And I'm sure quite a bit of that went on. And if you know a lot about a person, you can know what presses their buttons and send them things that will manipulate their behavior. Those hundreds of millions of dollars that Musk put into supporting Trump probably went into things like that. I wouldn't be surprised if they did. And then there's obviously cyber criminals using it for cyber attacks, which is very scary because these things are getting better and better at cyber attacks. There's people using it to make nasty viruses. There's lethal autonomous weapons, which are going to be very nasty and are coming very soon. There's all those things that just depend on bad actors. And many people are aware of those things. And then there's things that are quite different that depend on AI itself trying to take over. And a lot of people, particularly people concerned with the other things like discrimination and bias in AI, say this AI taking over is just science fiction, it's nonsense. And that tends to go together with the belief that AI doesn't really understand anything. So what I now think of as old-fashioned linguists who are followers of Chomsky think this stuff doesn't understand anything. It's just a statistical trick using correlations. That belief gets a bit thin when you have arguments with it and it starts beating you at the arguments. I have a little game I play, which I enjoy a lot, which is you take some of the statements about how these large language models don't really understand what they're saying, and you give those statements to a large language model and ask it to explain what's wrong with the reasoning of the people who made those statements. And it gives very coherent explanations of what they're getting wrong. The nice thing about this game is it requires no effort on your part. All you have to do is type in the statements from these people. You don't even have to type them in. Just grab them and put them into GPT, and it'll tell you what's wrong with it. And they say, what's wrong with this? And it'll tell you exactly what's wrong with it. So it's quite satisfying to get the large language models explaining to the critics of large language models why they're wrong. And at that point, it seems just crazy to say they don't understand anything.
People point very much to the mistakes they make, the stupid mistakes that large language models make, as an evidence that they're not really understanding, that it is just correlation.
Yes. So I have various things to say about that. Two things in particular. If you take someone with low intellectual ability, with an IQ of 80 or something like that, they will sometimes make mistakes. They'll get some common sense things wrong. We don't say that means they didn't understand anything. What we say is that means they didn't understand that, and there's complicated things they don't understand. But we don't say that means they're not understanding at all, that there's no understanding there, just because they made a mistake. That would be kind of crazy. The second thing is people make mistakes like this. Even people of average intelligence make mistakes like this all the time. Now, people are generally better, at least until recently, at recognizing when they got things wrong and sort of filtering it and doing a bit of reasoning that can't be right. But they make mistakes all the time. So it's called hallucinations, but it ought to be called confabulations. Well, it's just a language model. There's no vision involved. It ought to be called confabulations. And psychologists have studied that since the 1930s and shown that just people confabulate all the time. So it's hard to prove that. When we're remembering things that happened a long time ago, we make up a story that sounds plausible to us.
Yes.
And we'll have some relation to the truth, but we'll have lots of the details wrong. It's normally hard to prove that because you need to know the precise details of something that happened a long time ago. But there are cases where you do know what happened. And the best case I know of is, there's a nice paper by Ulrich Neisser on John Dean's memory. So John Dean was Nixon's lawyer, and he testified under oath about conversations that had happened in the Oval Office. And at the time that he testified, he was unaware that there were tape recordings of those conversations. So he just said, basically what he produced in testimony was plausible kinds of meetings that might have happened given what was going on. And those meetings never actually happened. There were many of the meetings, it wasn't those precise people in the meeting. And it wasn't that person said something, it was somebody else said the same thing. And it wasn't quite that thing anyway. But it's clear he was trying to tell the truth. But when we remember stuff, what we're doing is just making up a story that sounds plausible to us. That's what memories are. Of course, if the events happened very recently, what sounds plausible to us is what actually happened. If the events happened longer ago, what sounds plausible to us is something like what happened, but influenced by things we've learned in the meantime. So human memory is full of confabulations. And the fact that these large language models just make stuff up shows they're more like us. It doesn't show they're less like us.
Would you say that those models are the closest we've got to exposing how the brain is actually processing information?
Yes, they're by far the closest we have to explaining what's going on in the brain when we're understanding language. So I think in broad terms, we understand language in the same way as these large models understand language. They're like us in that respect. And the people who say they're completely unlike us don't have a workable theory of how we understand language. The best theory we've got is these large language models.
If there is a very serious danger that they are going to become far more intelligent than us quite soon, what do you think should be happening now in order to protect against potentially bad effects of that?
Okay, so nearly all the leading researchers I know believe they will get more intelligent than us. Maybe not in everything all at once. They'll get better at different things at different times. They're already much better, for example, at playing Go or playing chess or figuring out how proteins will fold. They'll get better at different things at different times. They're much better. If I ask you to write a sonnet where half the words begin with B, you could probably do that, but it'd take you a whole day. And if you ask GPT-4 to do that, it'll just spit out the sonnet. So they're much better at things like that. They're already not very good experts at everything, and they're getting better fairly rapidly. So most researchers think they will get better than us, smarter than us. It's just a question of when. Some people seem to think it'll be in the next few years. I think that's optimistic, if you think it's a good thing. And I think it may take up to 20 years. I'd say probably within the next 20 years they'll get smarter than us. Mm-hmm. And they'll be agents too. They're already making them into agents. They can do things. They can talk to other ones and they can cooperate to achieve things.
So they can create their own goals.
And so they can create their own sub-goals at least. We may put in their top-level goals, but they'll generate sub-goals in order to achieve those. They'll probably generate the sub-goal of getting more control to make it easier to get things done. So the real question is not will they get more intelligent than us, but if they're more intelligent than us, will we have a way of making sure they don't want to take over? And we just don't know. We don't know whether that's possible. But given that you're about to make things more intelligent than you, it would seem wise to put a lot of resources into figuring out if you're going to be able to keep control. We're not going to stop AI. I think saying we should stop now, that might be the rational policy, but that's not going to happen. There's too many profits to be made. And governments want it too much for weapons and so on. They will say for defending themselves against cyber attacks, but at least half of them must be using it for inventing the cyber attacks.
It's a race of escalation.
Yeah. So they'll want it for that. So it's not going to be stopped. And we should be putting a lot of resources into figuring out, can we generate these hyper-intelligent agents in a way that allows us to stay in control? Now, some people believe we can. So Yann LeCun, who's a friend of mine, was my postdoc, believes we can. I think it's improbable, but we should put a lot of effort into seeing whether it's possible.
What form does that effort take? Is it regulation or it's research, really, isn't it?
It's research, but only the big companies have the resources to do this research, because it's research on the large cutting-edge models. My belief is governments are the only people who are powerful enough to deal with these large companies, and even they may not be. So my belief is the government ought to mandate that they spend a certain fraction of their computing resources on safety research. Now, it would be great if that happened. And the Biden administration was moving very timidly towards a little bit of regulation. In California, they were a bit more ambitious, and they said that you're going to require the large companies before they release these things to do a lot of safety tests and tell you the results. And that got vetoed by the governor. It got passed by the assemblies, but vetoed by the governor. And that was the first bill with real teeth. In Europe, the Europeans would like to have some regulation of AI, although they explicitly say we're not going to regulate military uses of AI because so many European companies want to use it for weapons. But recently, the UK and the US have said they're not going to sign on to the Europeans' declaration about AI safety. Basically, they explicitly say we'd rather have the profits than the safety. They say that by saying too much regulation will interfere with innovation. But you can rephrase that as when it's profits versus safety, profits win. And the governments are being advised by people who are, in Britain, for example, the Prime Minister is being advised by someone who holds lots of shares in AI startups.
It does seem a case of the industry policing itself, partly because, as you say, nobody else has access to the resources, but also because it's such a fast-moving area that people are finding it very hard to keep up with what's happening.
I find it very hard to keep up with what's happening. There's new models coming out every day, and there's new techniques being invented every day, because there's a very large number of very smart people working on it now. Yeah, I find that scary. So it will be hard to regulate. But if you say something like, spend a third of your computing resource on AI safety research, that's sort of more generic and easier to do.
I can see why it's to be wished for, but gosh, in getting people to focus on that question and the provision for potentially controlling what could become dangerously intelligent in the future, is there a danger that you neglect the current problems that AI presents, that alongside all the benefits in diagnostics and all sorts of things that it can do for education, etc., potentially, there is the threat of automation and large-scale unemployment, as well as all the bad actors that you've already mentioned, and that also needs to have attention paid to it. We need to, as a society, think about what we want now from AI, not just the danger of the future. And there's so much to think about. There's so much to worry about and potentially control and direct. It's too big. I
completely agree. There are these many different dangers. There's many short-term dangers. And It's not that we shouldn't think about those. I mainly speak about the long-term existential threat of these things getting more intelligent than us and taking over, because many people say that's just science fiction. And I feel I know enough about how these things work and how we work to say it's not science fiction. But that doesn't mean I'm not also very concerned about all the short-term things. It's just my particular expertise means I'm best placed to talk about these longer-term existential threats. But I do try and emphasize when I talk about those, there are also many short-term threats, like the social disruption, if these things replace all mundane intellectual labor with AI.
It all comes back, in a way, to the question that you've been asking all these years about how we work, what it is to be human.
That's becoming very central, what it is to be human, because the debate about whether these things will want to take over is all about, do they have desires and intentions? And many people think, for example, there's something that'll protect us, which is they're not conscious and we're conscious. We got something special that they ain't got, and they will never have. And I think that's just gibberish. I'm a materialist. Consciousness emerges in sufficiently complicated systems, perhaps systems complicated enough to be able to model themselves. And there's no reason why these things won't be conscious.
So we're going to have to learn how to live with them as well.
Hopefully, we can learn to live with them. That's the good scenario.
How do you think we should think of them in the future? As friends? Aliens?
Okay, so Jan, who thinks we're going to be safe, thinks we should think of them as servants. Good old-fashioned servants who do what you tell them to. And if they don't, you fire them. I'm just worried by the fact that there's very few cases of more intelligent things being controlled by less intelligent things. Once they're a lot smarter than us, I don't think they'll put up with that. Well, that's what worries me, at least. Now, there's one line of argument that's more promising, which is a lot of the nasty characteristics that people have come from evolution. We evolved with small warring bands of chimpanzees, or our common ancestor was chimpanzees, and that led to this intense loyalty to your own group and intense competition with other groups, being willing to kill members of other groups. That sort of shows up in our politics quite a lot right now. These things didn't evolve. And so it may be we can avoid a lot of that nastiness in things that didn't evolve.
It's a nice thought that we could learn how to behave from them.
Yes, in fact, AI mediators are now quite good at getting people with opposing views to come to see each other's view. So there's a lot of good can be done with AI. And if we can keep it safe, it's going to be a wonderful thing.
Hopeful note to end on. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking. Thank you very much indeed.
Okay, bye for now.
You just heard Nobel Prize Conversations. If you'd like to learn more about Geoffrey Hinton, you can go to nobelprize.org, where you'll find a wealth of information about the prizes and the people behind the discoveries. Nobel Prize Conversations is a podcast series with Adam Smith, a co-production of Filt and Nobel Prize Outreach. The producer for this episode was me, Karin Svensson. The editorial team also includes Andrew Hart and Olivia Lundqvist. Music by Epidemic Sound. If you're into big ideas, lateral thinking and in-depth explanations, why not check out our episode with 2020 physics laureate Roger Penrose? You can find previous seasons and conversations on Acast or wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks for listening.